Hello and welcome to the newest episode of the Power of Salutogenesis Health Unlocked. Jason, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good.
Um, I know you messaged me yesterday night, and that was a great news. Thanks to our listeners, we were actually in top 10 in the alternative health category in Apple charts. Number 10, we just made it. But, uh, but, uh, but yeah, great news. And this was, uh, one thing that happens is once you break into Apple charts, the Apple gods are friendly to you and then they recommend you to more people. So that's obviously helping. And, the second thing I would say is, obviously all the insights that you've been sharing is I'm sure it's resonating with people. That's why we get more people to listen it. So that's obviously helping. Are you excited about that?
Yeah, yeah. We're going to try and do a lot of things that will need a broader reach to people. So this is only going to help for sure.
Yeah. All right. So today's topic, we are going to talk about a lot about healing, a lot about aging, and let's go straight into our discussion. So let's start with the first question. So, uh, you have mentioned before that healing is actually a cycle. What do you mean by that, and how does it relate to aging? Let's start there.
Right. So healing isn't just a one-time event where the body, fixes something and then moves on. It actually follows a very specific biological program cycle, and that's the cell danger response, or the CDR. We've talked about this a bunch, but I'll go through it again. There are three main phases. You've got CDR1, and that is the initial danger response when the cell detects a threat and signals for inflammation and isolation. Then CDR2 is the repair and regeneration phase, where the cell rebuilds is in proliferation. And then CDR3 is the reintegration, and that's where the cell normalizes and reconnects with all of its surrounding tissue using the proper mitochondrial metabolism and all that. And then the problem arises when a cell gets stuck in one of those phases. And that could be due to it's overwhelmed by stress or the lack of resources to move forward, or it gets confused by persistent signaling. And when that happens, the healing cycle doesn't complete correctly, and instead of resolution, you get what's called the persistence, or CDR persistence. And that brings us to aging. So in previous episodes, we've talked about this, and we kind of left it somewhat general, but the chronic disease starts to occur when lots of cells start doing this all at the same time. But so aging, let me switch gear and then talk about aging. So aging isn't really just cells wearing out. And by the way, again, rather than referencing every time I say something, I'm going to say that almost all of this comes from Dr. Naviaux's research. So again, aging isn't just cells wearing out. It's that you get a bunch of cells that never actually finish the healing cycle. And over time, these unfinished repairs start to build up. And it's not always enough to cause disease on their own, but enough to slow things down, degrade tissue quality, and reduce resilience. And we've talked about that before as well, in the context of the chronic illness or let's say cancer. You get the large number of the cells get stuck in that healing cycle. We were talking about CDR2 for cancer. And that leads to the unchecked proliferation, or this chronic dysfunction. But again, in this episode, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the slower, quieter version of the same process. And when it happens just a few cells at a time, gradually accumulating, that's what aging really is. Not the breakdown, but unresolved healing, kind of scaled across time.
And the way you are kind of explaining is it's basically aging is related to, or what we call aging is healing. That's what you're saying. There's a correlation there, or how we should think about aging. So before we jump into that, can you unpack what it means to think of aging as unresolved healing rather than just, the slow decline that we think it is?
Yeah, sure. So I think this is one of the kind of the most important shifts in how we think about aging. We're used to seeing aging as kind of a slow breakdown and like parts wearing out. But in this particular system, we're continually rebuilding and repairing ourselves as well, right? So the reality is much more dynamic. And what's really happening here is that the body keeps initiating healing, and increasingly it can't quite finish. And so kind of a better analogy, rather than think about parts wearing out, is routine upkeep. So think of a well-maintained building, and right. So with consistent and thorough upkeep, then, fixing leaks and repairing, or replacing worn parts or repairing things and repainting it, all that kind of stuff, it can last practically forever. But if you start skimping on that maintenance, and not all at once, just a little bit here and there, some repairs get delayed or kind of done halfway. At first, no one really notices, and the lights flicker, or the door that doesn't quite close right, or all that kind of stuff. It's not a big deal. But over time, those small little unresolved issues begin to accumulate, and the systems start kind of working against each other, and the building becomes harder to manage. And eventually, things start to actually fail. That's what aging is at the cellular level. The healing cycle gets triggered, so the CDR gets triggered routinely. This is just normal. But if the body doesn't have what it needs to complete it, then a cell or some cells might get stuck kind of mid-process. And again, one or two or a few of them is manageable. But the accumulation, really the backlog, that's what starts to degrade tissue function, resilience, and coordination over time. So aging isn't really a passive decline. It's unfinished healing that gets stacked over decades. Can that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, we talked about this a little bit earlier too, the stress playing the bigger role in aging. Can you go a little deeper and explain how stress and healing kind of interact over time and also impact the healing process?
Yeah. So definitely that's a critical piece. We understand stress isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's what activates the healing cycle in the first place. When the body senses a threat, whether it's a toxin, a microbe, physical injury, or even emotional stress, it initiates a CDR, which is the first phase of healing. That's the body saying, something's wrong, let's respond. And so the problem isn't the stress itself, it's the persistence or repetition of that stress without full resolution is where we get even worse. So if you trigger that CDR1, again, before the previous cycle completes, then the cell doesn't get to progress to CDR2 or 3, and it kind of gets stuck at the starting line. And it means that the healing process keeps resetting without ever finishing. That's a possibility of things going wrong. And when that happens over and over, you kind of get this stacking effect, right? And cells start accumulating in these half-healed states, that's where the dysfunction really starts to then spread across tissues. So earlier we talked about how stress can push us toward dysfunction and resilience. Or dysfunction or resilience. I think that was, I don't remember, episode 2 or 3, long time ago. But it pushes us towards either, remember the whole scale and everything, pushes either towards dysfunction or resilience, depending on how it's handled. And that's the kind of this is the cellular version of that. Right. So if stress is resolved properly, the body adapts and becomes more resilient. But if it just keeps coming faster than the system can process it, the body starts to shift towards dysfunction. So aging isn't just about getting stressed, or not aging isn't about not getting stressed, although that can help. It's about not having the time and resources to finish that healing process before you start it all over again. And the more that happens, the more that unfinished work piles up.
Let me ask you this: is there like thresholds of when this when let's say that repair or the repair is triggered, but then the level or there was some threshold that was crossed that caused the dysfunction? Is there something like this known measurable threshold for this, or at all nothing?
Well, sure, but that's going to be different for every different person, all the different tissues and the different locations. It depends on how much stress they've seen before and how often they've been able to handle that stress, and how much improvement that they've been able to go through. Right. So, how resilient have these tissues become? But again, remember, we need to have stress to induce the resiliency adaptation in the first place. So again, it's not like stress is bad. It's just chronic stress is bad, because the body, either obviously too much stress is bad as well, because then the body can't adapt to it, and that ends up just being a negative. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. What you're saying is it depends on different body types. So it's not like one number, but each one of us has its own benchmark, and then that will, or threshold, based on that it reacts. Our body reacts to that and triggers the either.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. And it's easier to think how this mechanism will work when it's physical, when it's physical stress. So if there is injury, there is infection, and that triggers it. It's more complex on how this happens when it's just emotional or mental stress in that level. So how does emotional stress actually initiate the CDR? Can you talk about that? And what's the, I guess, what's the mechanism and link behind this?
Yeah. So actually, this is a great question, and I think it's a key distinction that we don't talk about enough, because everyone says, "Oh, stress is stress," whether it's emotional or you roll your ankle. But it's hard to find that link. So when I say emotional stress can trigger the CDR the same way any physical stress can, it's not like feeling of anxiety directly zaps your cells into danger mode. It's actually a little bit more indirect, but no less real. What happens is the brain, particular areas like the hypothalamus and the brainstem, respond to emotional stress by changing its output signals to the rest of the body. That includes increasing cortisol through the HPA axis, and activating the sympathetic nervous system, suppressing the parasympathetic nervous system, or the vagus-driven anti-inflammatory signaling. And so these outputs change how your body manages things like metabolism and immune tone, blood flow, oxygenation, which we've talked about a bunch. And so over time, or even acutely, this can destabilize mitochondrial function in peripheral cells, leading them to release DAMPs. Remember the damage-associated molecular patterns, things like ATP and uric acid and reactive oxygen species, and that's actually what kicks off the CDR. So it's really the same DAMPs that are being sent out by the signal, or that are being sent out of specific cells based on some of the brain's inputs, right? So emotional stress leads to this neuroendocrine signaling, which leads to metabolic and immune imbalance, which then creates the same danger signals that a physical injury would. Let's see. So in other words, I guess the cell isn't reacting to your feelings per se. It's reacting to the biochemical fallout of your brain trying to manage those feelings with, hormonal or hormone cascades. And that's how emotional stress becomes cellular stress.
So really,
So really, it is the same thing. There's just another step in the process.
Right. And the last step is the step that was added to this is like the threat signaling that happens through this. Basically the signals in emotional stress, it's the signals. In physical changes, it's directly from there on the stress pushes this to the change, the triggers repair work or response.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And when people say like I just don't bounce back like I used to, which is very common in especially also in aging, is that really about slower healing and or something else?
Yes, but not in the way that most people think, right? So it's not that the healing suddenly slows down because we're old. It's that honestly, even when you're young and healthy, the healing process isn't perfect, right? It's good. It's actually remarkably good, but it's not flawless. And every time the body kicks off a healing cycle, a few cells might get stuck, and maybe they stall in, inflammation or in the rebuilding phase, or even, right near the end when they're supposed to reintegrate. And normally those cells get identified and cleared, recycled by the immune system. But again, the process isn't perfect, and if you slip through, and that's okay for a while. A few stalled cells don't make any difference. I was going to say not much of a difference, but almost no difference at all. But over time, they accumulate, and they're not neutral, I suppose. They're still metabolically active. They still end up using oxygen and nutrients and immune bandwidth and that kind of stuff. But they end up like taking, and they don't give anything back. They're not adding anything to the organism. And eventually that hidden overhead is the best way to look at it. That hidden overhead starts to slow everything else down. And it becomes harder to launch new healing cycles. Inflammation lingers a little bit longer. Recovery takes more effort. So that feeling of not bouncing back is actually the result of compound biological backlog. Not because the body's broken, but because it's running a slightly imperfect process, or has been for decades. And then that's why aging accelerates over time. Again, not wear and tear, more unfinished business. And if we go back to my building analogy, it's like, if one or two get missed, it's not a big deal. But if those little unfinished repairs keep piling up year after year, eventually the whole system starts to run slower. Not because it's old, but because it's overloaded.
So is it just like the healing gets slower, or is it like at times when, there's also chronic pain that goes on? So that in that case, there is probably no healing at all, right? So in that case, it's not just slowed down. It's just the other, other basket where it's just not going to heal at all. It's just going to stay.
Well, okay, wait a minute. So, when you say it, what are you really talking about? Are you talking about the cells that haven't progressed through? Well, no. Yes. So sometimes the cells do get stuck, and this is kind of a routine thing. We were talking about like in the case with cancer, we were talking about a fungal trigger is actually then overwhelming signaling and helping to keep the cell stuck in the CDR too. But that also just happens, with a few cells here and there every once in a while anyways. Their signaling gets messed up or something happens and they can't come out. And that's what we're talking about with aging is this happens fairly regularly where the cells don't fully complete. And again, when it's an individual cell, it's not that big a deal. The body has processes to take care of that. But in many cases, then, well, I guess in all cases, because pretty much everybody ages, all of these individual cells kind of get stuck in this spot, and they don't. So they're still, as I said, they're still metabolically active. They still take from the system. They still take some of your energy, but they don't really give anything back. They're not integrated into the tissues to actually do what those tissues are supposed to do, whether whether it's in your muscles or in your bones or wherever those tissues are. And that's the problem. As we age, these little tiny, you can think of like kind of sand specks all over the body, start to accumulate. And then at some point, well, now they are significant. It's not just one or two, it's a lot. And now you've got a lot of extra cells that aren't doing anything for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And on these cells specifically, so we, the senescence, what are the cellular senescence and why does it matter? Can you go and give us explanation of this in detail, please?
Yes. So it's senescent cells or senescence. And this is kind of where it gets interesting. This is kind of the next step, right? So, when my parents got sick, and I was kind of desperate for answers, I kept, seeing, these therapies that worked for some people and not others, and nothing really made sense. Remember, I mentioned that kind of the first thing that I did when I started studying all this is to try and figure out, well, why do these things work sometimes? I don't care what it's alternative, it's conventional. I don't care what it is. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Why? And looking back now, I think it's clear that I was asking the wrong question. I was focused on the disease and the diagnosis and the symptoms, because that's what conventional medicine focuses on. But what I really needed to understand was healing and what happens when it doesn't finish, right? So, and that's really also why I kind of latched on to the cell danger response as a model, not just to understand disease, but to really explain health. And from there, cellular senescence becomes the next kind of big mental leap here in understanding. It helps me see what the body does when healing can't move forward, right? And why that's both a brilliant adaptation, I guess, in the body, and also a potential roadblock. So, senescence is often misunderstood as just cellular aging, but it's a lot more specific and a lot more active. So when a cell becomes senescent, it essentially enters a shutdown mode rather than staying stuck in the persistent CDR. So we've talked about how cells can get stuck. Well, that's pretty dangerous. And so our body has kind of this first layer of defense to where they actually sort of get kicked out sideways, and they exit the CDR, but not correctly. They become senescent cells, right? So let's go through that. Let's say it was in CDR2 where that got stuck and it gets kicked out sideways. It actually stops dividing. It alters its metabolic behavior a little bit, and it begins secreting a mix of signals called the senescence-associated secretory phenotype, or SASP. And that is that signal is intended to get the immune system to come and clear it out. But and really, this is the key. Not all senescent cells are the same. And the type of senescence a cell enters depends on where in the healing cycle it got stuck. That makes sense, right? So if the cell was stuck in CDR1, that early danger response inflammatory phase, its senescence form tends to be highly or more inflammatory. And then those are the SASP, I don't know if I'm supposed to say that, SASP? it's hard to say. Those are the SASP heavy cells that we associate with kind of, that help. Well, I don't want to say help. That can exacerbate autoimmune disease and systemic inflammation. And that, again, that might sound harmful, but it's actually less harmful than the cell staying stuck in the full CDR1. So here, senescence really kind of lowers the threat level by sort of disarming the cell a little bit. In CDR2, where the cell's trying to proliferate and rebuild and replace lost biomass, the senescence acts as a self-limiting mechanism. So it shuts down the cell's ability to divide, preventing it from becoming cancerous, which is good. And that's when, so we actually call those cells oncoprotective, not because they're stopping cancer from happening elsewhere. They're not defending anything else. They're preventing their own transformation into a cancerous cell. And then CDR3, where the cell should be reintegrating, senescence often leads to just metabolic dysfunction. And so the cell isn't really inflamed and dividing, obviously, but it's also no longer contributing to tissue function just like the others. And again, becomes a problem over time, especially in highly integrated tissues like, the brain or the muscles and stuff. So, senescence isn't just a passive state. It's an active adaptation, way to contain dysfunction, I suppose, not necessarily resolve it. That the intent isn't for the body to resolve the dysfunction here. But now if those cells accumulate, they begin to disrupt the tissue environment. And that's kind of why understanding where senescent cells come from in the healing cycle matters, right? It shapes the kind of dysfunction that they cause, assuming that they accumulate and stick around, and how urgently they need to be cleared, and what kind of support or intervention might restore balance and such.
Yeah, and why does the senescence exist at all? Like, we can still remove it, right? Like, but we don't do that. Why not just remove the dysfunctional cells?
So, yeah, good question. Ideally, the body does remove the senescent cells, right? So that's the first line of defense is apoptosis or programmed cell death. So if a cell recognizes that it's too damaged to recover, it's supposed to self-terminate early. But in CDR1 and CDR2, they're designed not to do that. So they're kind of in the fight or repair mode. Apoptosis is suppressed during those phases. So if something goes wrong and the cell gets stuck there, they usually won't initiate death on their own. Now, that's actually where the immune system is supposed to step in, and immune cells like the NK cells or the cytotoxic T cells, they can detect the problem, and then they send the kill signal, and that's immune-mediated apoptosis. But even then, the cell has to carry out the process. And so if key systems like P53, which is that protein that is involved in the apoptotic pathways, and then the BAC or mitochondrial signaling, if any of that stuff's impaired, the cell might not be able to actually follow through after getting the termination order. And then that's where senescence comes in. Right? So you can think of this kind of as the body's layered safety systems. So first, the cell tries to fix itself, and if that fails, then it self-destructs or self-terminates. If that doesn't work, then the second layer is the immune system steps in and initiates the termination. If that doesn't work, then the third thing is the cell enters senescence. Which is that kind of emergency lockdown. It kicks it out to the side. And then finally, what you're asking is senescent cells can be removed later through maintenance surveillance, or immune surveillance, I suppose. But that process is slower, less reliable, and depends heavily on immune bandwidth, right? So remember, they're sending out that signal. That's why they're sending out that SASP signal. so that the immune system can find them and take care of them. So I guess senescence really exists because of biology needed that last fail-safe, a way to contain cells that couldn't be fixed or eliminated, and it is meant to be temporary. So senescent cells send out the signal not because they're inherently toxic, but because they're asking to be cleared. And so the real problem is the rate of senescent cell creation exceeds the rate of clearance. That makes sense. So that imbalance is tolerated for a pretty long time, but eventually, as senescent cells accumulate, they begin to interfere with immune signaling and tissue coordination and all that kind of stuff, which slows the clearance even further. And that's why aging really behaves like an exponential curve, right? For years, the system, keeps pace, and the amount of senescent cells stays pretty darn low for a long time because, yes, you're creating more than you're clearing, but not by a lot, and that takes a long time. At some point, the tipping point hits, and then clearance starts slowing. Because you have the added, how do I say that? So the clearance slows, the dysfunction rises, and the rate of accumulation really takes off, right? And after that, it's not a little gentle slope anymore. It's kind of like a cliff. And that's the point where the system begins to fail. And, to be blunt, what we call death from old age is really the moment when a critical system can't keep pace with the backlog and it spirals out of control.
And to give this like a real world example to bring this home, can you talk about a moment where this healing interruption was visible and give kind of like a paint the picture for this, explaining this whole?
Sure. One of the clearest examples would be a physical injury that never quite healed right? So maybe it's an old sprained ankle. I've got one. Or, a shoulder that's a little stiffer than it used to be. It's not disabling, but it's noticeable. It doesn't feel like it used to, right? So what probably happened here is that the body launched its normal healing response, CDR1 to isolate the damage, CDR2 to rebuild and repair, and then CDR3 to reintegrate the tissue. But somewhere in that process, something stalled. And, maybe you didn't get enough rest. Maybe your stress levels were too high. Maybe oxygen or nutrient delivery was impaired. Could be a bunch of different things. Whatever the cause, some of those cells never made it through the full cycle. Instead, they got stuck and then they entered senescence. And remember, senescent cells send out that SASP inflammatory signal so that the immune system will come clear them out. But if the immune system's already spread thin, or the local environment is flooded with other low-grade stress signals, those calls for help don't really get answered. And the result is that senescent cells stay put, creating just enough noise to keep things slightly off without triggering, that full repair response so that it can heal. And here's actually where it gets a little bit more interesting. The brain does get involved. And during the original injury, your nervous system mapped the region as unstable. And if the healing never truly resolved, the brain might continue treating the areas as fragile, for lack of a better word. And it can stay overly sensitive to minor threat signals from that tissue, things like movement or pressure or other low-grade inflammation may be caused by that SASP signals being sent out by the senescent cells in the first place. And it interprets that as ongoing threat. And that results in things like chronic tension or reduced range of motion, even persistent low-level pain, which I think you talked about earlier. And the tissue itself might be structurally fine, but functionally, it's kind of trapped in this loop because the brain and the immune system are still sort of treating it like it's in danger. So what you're seeing in that particular example of a lingering injury is a kind of a closed loop system, right? So stalled healing process creates senescent cells that then persist, and those cells leak inflammatory signals. The immune system doesn't get it's not enough, or it's flooded so that the immune system doesn't get or doesn't respond aggressively enough. The brain stays on alert, and then all of that together, you kind of maintain this subtle, but from your perspective, real dysfunction. And just want to point out, so in that example, enough senescent cells were created all at once that you notice the functional change immediately, right? Now, often the number of senescent cells are well below the noticeable threshold. Imagine the same process is occurring, across dozens of tissues, your joints and blood vessels and digestive lining and the brain. That's aging, not wear and tear, but that, right? A backlog of healing that never finished, reinforced by the body's own then protective systems. Right? And I've lived this pattern. I've had injuries that didn't heal perfectly, and I've watched people I care about go through treatments that they never seem to fully respond to anything or get fully resolved. And I think many people kind of carry these sort of half-finished stories in their body, where the outside seems okay, but something deeper is never quite completed, right? And that's not failure per se. It's just that the healing got interrupted and never finished.
Yeah. And if aging is this unresolved healing, does that mean we can slow this thing or even reverse it by helping the body finish the repair cycle? Is there something that can be done? What's your take on that?
Yes, and this is where kind of this whole perspective becomes really powerful. When you understand aging isn't just decay, it's simply unfinished business. Then anything we can do to help the body complete the healing cycle could slow aging or even reverse it. And we're not really talking about magic bullets here. We're talking about core biological prerequisites for resolution, right? And we've talked about a lot of this before: mitochondrial function, metabolic flexibility, immune surveillance, cellular nutrition, availability. Basically, these are the things that allow a cell to move through the CDR phases. So instead of trying to fight aging, we should be able, or I guess, if we just finished healing more effectively, that's what we're really looking for, right? And that starts with, again, improving mitochondrial function. So cells have the energy and the signaling capacity to move through each phase, supporting metabolic flexibility, which again, that's the ability to switch between fuel sources, maintain that helps to maintain redox balance and respond to oxygen gradients and such. We want to minimize local immune fatigue so the body can actually clear cells that need to be removed. And so when they become senescent, if we've got good local immune function, then the immune system can see those SASP signals, go in and clear out the senescent cells. That's just right there. That is effectively reducing aging. And then we also want to ensure that the apoptotic pathways are intact, right? So dysfunctional cells don't have to be parked in senescence in the first place, or at least less often. And some of this we can influence systemically through diet and movement and stress reduction and a general salutogenic lifestyle. But I'm going to kind of come back to much of this is local, right? Healing doesn't happen across the body or across the whole body all at once. It happens tissue by tissue and cell by cell. And that's where targeted cellular support comes in. When we deliver the right ions, nutrients, and such, whatever the regulatory inputs directly to the cells under stress, we're not forcing an outcome. We're restoring the abilities or the body's ability to choose what it needs to do. And this is kind of exactly where many conventional or kratogenic drugs fall short, right? They may shut down inflammation or override some signaling pathway, but they do it by disrupting the body's internal regulation. And when the timing is off, it can actually interrupt healing instead of helping it. A real good example is you roll your ankle swells up, you want to go do something and you don't like the swelling, you immediately take, Advil or Tylenol or something to reduce the swelling. The swelling's there for a reason. And the inflammation's there for a reason. When you make it go away before the repairs have been done, the repairs might not get done correctly. So this is kind of also where I think some of the kind of more popular, since we're talking about aging, anti-aging drugs, maybe, missing the point a little bit. So drugs like, what are they using? Metformin and rapamycin. So they aim to slow metabolism or mimic caloric restriction. But if healing depends on energy availability and metabolic competence, then suppressing your metabolism could actually interfere with the body's ability to finish what it started. And so I'm not the only one who's raising concern over that. Chris Masterjohn just wrote a piece about it, how the entire idea of slowing metabolism to extend life might be one of the worst longevity concepts ever conceived. I think that's how he titled his little article. Because, when you suppress the cellular activity across the board, you're not just slowing aging, you're also slowing healing, immune surveillance, mitochondrial repair. All of these things are the very things that the body needs to stay functional. And it's a great example of a kratogenic approach. It might buy you some time in one system, but at the cost of overall adaptive capacity. And to me, that's kind of the wrong trade-off. Instead of slowing cells down, we should be supporting their ability to finish, specifically healing. And if we do that, cells don't need to become senescent in the first place, or we can minimize that so they can really finish what they started. That's what I believe real anti-aging looks like. Not metabolic suppression, but metabolic adaptability and the ability to move between, fat burning, carb burning, and fasting states. Because remember, those drugs were to mimic the fasting state, right? We want to be able to switch back and forth between all of these things depending on what the body needs. And that's not just efficient, it becomes much more resilient at that point.
Isn't most of the drugs kind of actually fall into the category where they are forcing the body and not supporting the resolution pathways? So I just feel like it's like as a practice, is it how do we make that judgment as a consumer of drugs and all that stuff? How does it reflect? What can patients do, or just in general, like how people can do? What can we do as part of this?
I guess I would say start really studying what salutogenics means, right? So we do get trapped into this thinking that, we've done enough scientific work and research to understand that this particular signal that's coming off and this particular pathway is doing things that we don't like. We don't understand the big picture necessarily of why it's doing it, when it's doing it, so on and so forth. All we know is that this is also causing the things we don't like, the symptoms we don't like. And I think that there's too much of the mindset that, I could do all sorts of these other things that could support my body to help this pathway be used correctly, but there's too many other things in here, too many variables, too much, there's too much chance that my body will actually do what I want it to do. And that's where the thought process of, well, this Kratogenic drug that will force my body, basically make my cells no longer able to adequately produce that signal. Well, then I know it's going to work, right? I know that my body will no longer be able to inflame this area anymore, and my inflammation will go down. But again, you're ignoring the bigger picture of why your body was trying to do that. And this is where, and then we also get into the body wasn't designed to handle chronic stress, or it didn't evolve to handle chronic stress because those didn't exist. And so we get, and again, this happens locally, you get a local area of cells that increase their nutrition requirement specifically for some of these metal ions, at least that's what we're finding, to the point where our body wasn't designed to be able to supply that need systemically. And, so previously the only option we had was to, change your diet and start getting some of, more of these nutrients or whatever. And then eventually, hopefully we get enough to that area, because that area does increase its, transporters and, sucks more out of the systemic flow. But again, you get into a rate limited thing where sometimes our body can recover from these persistent stressors or persistent things, but it just takes a really long time. Or, we get stuck into a situation of there's kind of this vicious circle occurring at the local area, and that dysfunction continues to increase the demand for these. How do I put that? The rate of increase of demand is more than what can be supplied, in which case you can never get out of that loop. And that's where salutogenic practices, especially when applied to a local area, can start having some benefit. But again, we're so used to thinking that, oh, well, scientists have identified that this pathway is the problem, and I don't want to, try and take some vitamins or exercise or all of whatever the other salutogenic things that you might be doing to try and fix this, because you're leaving too much up to chance. If you just take a drug that stops your body from producing that signal, well, that's really easy, right? Sure, we can do it. But your body was producing that signal for a reason. And it was, and now that could be a bad reason. It could be that the body was stuck into this, this process. And so sometimes Kratogenic drugs work, right? Sometimes they actually do the right thing. And that's just enough of a reset for the body to then take over and heal correctly. And that's why they work sometimes. But there's a lot of stuff about how and when and why the body's doing things that we don't understand. And that's part of the reason why Kratogenics or Kratogenic drugs are so dangerous and can cause so many problems.
So before we end today's episode, now, where does this takes us? I mean, what's the future of aging or aging research through this lens will look like? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So again, I think the big realization here is that aging and chronic disease really aren't as separate as we think they are. They're kind of the same thing, the same process, just happening at different speeds. If a few cells get stuck in the healing cycle and don't resolve properly, they kick out, become senescent, and for whatever reason, the body doesn't ever clear them out. Or the body clears them out slower than the body is creating them. We call that aging. If a large number gets stuck all at once in a particular tissue, then that leads to what we call chronic disease. And remember, all sorts of different chronic diseases can result from CDR1 persistence, CDR2 persistence, and CDR3 persistence. And I guess the reason that's important is, our bodies, again, were never designed to handle persistent CDR at scale. We evolved in environments where stress came in, short, sharp bursts. And we were built to respond, repair, and then reset. But today with the constant stressors, nutritional, environmental, emotional, the healing cycle gets triggered a lot more often, and completed a lot less. And when that happens on a wide enough scale, the system falls behind, or I guess I should say falls more behind faster. And so I believe that the future of aging research isn't about hacking biology or biological systems. It's about restoring resolution capacity. Means, supporting the body's ability to complete the healing cycle, clear what needs to be cleared, reinstate function where it's been lost. And that's what I believe the next evolution in therapy is headed as well, right? Not this blunt force kind of interventions, but toward salutogenic therapeutics. And that's what we're trying to do with IBAL. IBAL doesn't force the cell to do things. It supports the environment that lets the cell decide. And it supplies the ions like zinc, copper, sulfates, and others locally where the healing is stalled to either reinforce reintegration if the cell can still recover, or support proper apoptosis if the cell's beyond repair and needs to be removed. Which is interesting. The same ions help renature P53, and they can re-enable the back signaling and restore mitochondrial decision-making capacity. I guess that's the best way to put it. And that's the key, right? So we're not dictating an outcome. We're simply restoring the ability to complete the cycle, whatever that means for the cell in that moment. And because healing happens locally, this kind of therapy needs to work locally as well. That's why IBAL is, it's not just a supplement. It's a platform for targeted cellular restoration wherever the body's stuck. So when we talk about the future of aging, I think we really do need to kind of shift the goal from not how do we stop aging, but how do we help the body routinely finish what it started? Because we can do that at the cellular level and at the tissue level. The aging, it doesn't have to be a cliff, right? It can be something that we can manage, modulate, and maybe slow down significantly. Then once you've done that, you've controlled the senescent cell production rate, how quickly we're producing those. And then you can work on methods of, how to increase their clearance. That likely involves enhancing local immune surveillance or responsiveness and restoring those recognition signals, right? So remember, a lot of this still comes down to local immune function, which I guess I'll say is the opposite of the local immune fatigue. But really, it's still in a big way tied to those tissue resident macrophages, right? And if we can apply that same framework to chronic disease, we're not just extending life, we're restoring the quality of it. And that's what I think the future should look like, right? That's why, honestly, this is why so many therapies seem to help sometimes. I guess I'll tie this back to what I said at the beginning. They're all kind of poking at the same problem, which is unresolved healing. Some improve oxygenation, some tweak redox state, some support mitochondrial enzymes or circulation, and when they land kind of at the right time in the right place, regardless of whether it's alternative or conventional, they work. But if the cell can't follow through or the resolution pathways are too impaired, the therapy fails. And that's, that's not really just the therapy failing. It's a signal that the body doesn't have what it needs to do what it's supposed to be doing at that point. And I guess for me, that's not just theory here. It is pretty personal. And this is the question that I've been asking. Remember, I've said it earlier. Why do some of these therapies work for some people at some times and not others? And now I realize that it wasn't, the therapy isn't the outcome, right? Or the outcome depends on whether the body can finish healing. And that's also, from a salutogenic standpoint, that's not treating disease, that's creating healing.
And can you also answer one question on the IBAL specifically? That
Sure.
it's obviously it supports in helping body finish what it started, right? That's one part of it. But I want to know more about proactive use of it, because we know we will use something like IBAL if we have a certain condition. But
Sure.
because this is salutogenic, can things like IBAL be used even before, like before you actually got
Absolutely.
to? So, could you walk through those scenarios? How would that work? Like, just one or two examples. When would you?
I mean, I use it every day, not because I have significant issues, but because everyone in my family got cancer, and I'd prefer not to also get cancer. So how's it getting rid of cancer? Well, it was getting rid of cancer because it can cut through biofilm, it can enter the cells. The zinc, copper, and sulfates thoroughly eradicate any fungal, intracellular fungal infection that could then overwhelm the CDR progression signals and keep the cell locked in CDR2, and then it can become cancerous. And then more than that, the zinc and the copper are cofactors for superoxide dismutase, so it can very rapidly reduce the oxidative or the runaway oxidative stress signaling, which is one of the biggest signals of all of this stuff, and basically resets all of that. So we eliminate the triggers of whatever's triggering the CDR in the first place, and then we reset the signaling to basically break any of the overwhelming feedback loops, and then let the cells decide what they really should do. Now, if they should be in inflammatory conditions, well, then they'll actually probably use the copper to create inflammation, to create reactive oxygen species. But the point is, the cell gets to decide that. And so you don't have to have cancer for any of that to happen, right? And so not only are all these essential ions helping to improve the structural cell, they're also helping to improve those resident or tissue resident macrophages. So it's also increasing the local immune system, and it gets absorbed and used quickly enough within the body that, if you were to put it over your skin, yes, it's going to kill the microbiome there pretty quickly, but it's also gone pretty fast and absorbed, in which case the microbiome that can then come back in. And so in that case, what's happening is you're continually keeping the microbiome in a healthier state, rather than letting it get to, or, letting one particular microbe that our body isn't very good at regulating get into an overgrowth state. So yes, it does kill any microbe, in which case it would kill our microbiome as well. But unless you're really jumping into a vat of it, it's not hitting everywhere, and it allows all of that to come back really quickly. Whereas, you take antibiotics, that stays in your system for a long time. It's intended to kill it not super fast, but over a long period of time, and keep it gone for a long period of time. That's not what IBAL does at all. It kills it really, really fast, and then the microbiome can come back the way that it should in a healthier state. And when I say it comes back in a healthier state, it's because it's killing everything and then getting rid of anything that was in an overgrowth state that the body can't modulate well, right? Remember, we call, let's bacteria, right? We call some bacteria good bacteria, another bacteria bad bacteria. And why? Well, probably a couple reasons, right? The good bacteria, our body can regulate well, and its metabolic outputs our body can use. Whereas we'll call it bad bacteria if our body's not real good at regulating and it could just take over stuff. Well, our body, that's not so good for us. Or if its outputs are only negative to us, well, then we don't want that there in the first place. But if you look at a good bacteria, it's not like it's trying to help us. It's trying to proliferate and grow as well as it can. And if things shift within the terrain that make it so that it can proliferate better, it will. And so even good bacteria could get into an overgrowth state. So you hear candida, oh, and that's really bad. Well, candida is part of a healthy microbiome. It's just nobody talks about it unless it's in an overgrowth state. And then in that case, well, yeah, then it's bad. You don't want to completely eliminate it. You want it to get back down to where your body can regulate it correctly. And so kind of, I don't know, this comes back to there's lots of things in life aren't black and white. Everything is shades of gray. The more gray you've got, the more black it looks. But that doesn't mean wipe it away and make it white, because then it's gone. And if it was giving you anything good, well, it's gone. It won't anymore. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling now.
No, this is, I was more in, I have many questions now outside of, because I'm like, whoa, so technically if, somebody who is in, again, nothing that I'm not quoting you here on this is just more of my opinion based on this conversation. And it's more like, oh, somebody if, has, I don't know, more like emotional trauma, for example, right? And if they use, IBAL just as in, almost like preventative, like how you're using on daily use. And that should also help them at least that kind of, because at the end of the day, these traumas and this also going to cause cancer, that causes cancers. So you can potentially avoid those things also, just because there is this emotional stress that's triggering all these things that we talked about, and that's causing cells to be, and then even turn into sometimes cancer cells. So I'm thinking those applications, right? Because
Sure.
yeah.
I would actually go further than that, right? I don't think that we can avoid these chronic stressors in the environment anymore, right?
Right.
When I say the environment, I'm not just talking about chemicals. I'm talking about, the stress of working, the stress of having to drive to work in traffic, breathing, pollution, the chemicals used to clean your clothes, whatever you use to clean your hair, all of this stuff acts as threats to our cells because our body's never seen any of this stuff before. It doesn't know what it is. And, whether it's actually going to cause damage or the body just says, I don't know what that is. I better react as if it's a threat. It's the same thing. And so we're continually triggering the CDR in different areas. And, in your body, you probably have resilience in places that I don't. And you have deficiencies in places that I don't. And that's why we could do the exact same thing. And, at the end of your life, you get cancer in one spot, I get it in another. Why? Because you had certain deficiencies that I didn't, and I had ones that you didn't, and so on and so forth. But I use IBAL products, the cosmetic ones, every day. Whether that's, I don't know if I should say this, dropping it in my eyes, nebulizing it. The product actually isn't approved, or the products that I'm using aren't approved for that, but that's how I use them. Or just putting it on my skin in locations, all over the place. Knowing that, over time, I will get enough of this into my body, and it can kind of, first off, it can help improve the local immune function wherever I'm putting it. And then, if I'm putting it on lymphocytes and stuff, it kind of gets into the body, and you get a pseudo, and I need a different word for this, but it's a locally systemic effect, which is weird. So it's not everywhere, but it kind of eventually gets everywhere in a high enough concentration that we get some of that local effect. Now, honestly, that's a poor way to say treat an internal cancer, but until it can be injectable, that's all we've got. And to be honest, it's also working, right? People are using it to treat internal cancers by putting it on the outside of the body, and or even more what would be considered systemic issues, like leukemia or something like that, by putting it on lymphocytes and letting that bring it into the body, keep it concentrated enough when it gets to the different organs that it can still actually do something, knowing that we're not going to be able to inject this stuff for a while. But yeah, again, going off on a tangent, but I use it every day. And I was actually thinking about this. I'm not working out as much as I should be. So the whole MoCo protocols and everything, I haven't been very good at getting that started. I actually got other people set up more than myself. I've been really busy trying to do all of this stuff. And that's a really bad excuse, right? I shouldn't, I should walk the walk, rather than just talking the talk, for sure. But I'm also, going out and playing volleyball, every once in a while, and I'm still able to do it. And, I was actually thinking about that and wondering if I don't have the same types of dysfunctions as other people because of how much of this stuff I use. Now, I use more than most people would, for sure, because, I actually send it out for the manufacturer, and I don't charge him anything for that. In which case, he basically gives me whatever I want. So if I want some, I can just take it and tell him that I took it, and it's all good. So I don't really have to think about how much it costs when I use it, which means that I end up using a lot. And that would be interesting to see whether or not that really has had a lot more of what we would consider systemic or more significant effects in my body, rather than just keeping me from getting cancer or something along those lines, or making my skin prettier or whatever. Speaking of which, I don't know if you can tell, but it's kind of going away. But I got fried on it was Sunday. The weather here in Colorado's in the phase where it's we had a volleyball tournament going on Sunday, and so I was out in the sun pretty much the whole day, and it's we're still at the temperatures where you sit in the shade and it's a little cold. You sit in the sun and you get fried. And I put the stuff on my face and my legs because that's what got really burnt. And it went away fairly quickly. But I also realized I do this a lot, right? I don't like wearing sunscreen. I kind of don't like the things that are in it. So pretty much I'm getting fried almost every summer. Now I've got something that also kind of, fixes it, and I'm not super wrinkly. So sun is supposed to cause skin damage and so on and so forth, but I compare myself to other people my age and I look years younger than many. I'm probably a decade.
Yeah.
So it might be doing more than I think.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because also noticeably when we spoke on Monday, you look like more red.
Yeah, I was fried. Oh, yeah.
And now you look pretty clean, like you're like, fresh, how it was. So I was like,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah, so that might be that, right? So there must be something working just in your general cosmetic use or general use daily.
Yeah. And
So
I'll mention, I'm very white. So, when I was a kid, I lived in in Greece in the Mediterranean sun, and I never got burnt. But ever since, actually, probably college, everything changed. My hair is no longer blonde. It's now, well, actually, it's going white now. Although interestingly, less on this side than this side. And I have a couple moles here. Where is it? Here and here. I don't know if you can see that. That I put IBAL on all the time. And that actually might be one of the reasons why this side is much less gray than this side is, because it's keeping the cells a little bit more functional. Yeah.
well, if anything, I might have to try it by myself. That's how it is. I'm gonna order it and like get it and start trying it at least. That's where it is, and that's the beauty of using a salutogenic product. That's I don't have to worry about other stuff.
Yeah.
That's the thing,
You don't
right?
have to worry about much.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why. And of course, if our listeners, you want to buy it, you can tell us through our show's website or directly reach out to Jasen, and we have all the website links there that's related to Jasen, and wherever you get this show or this information. Well, thank you, Jasen, once again. This has been great. Another great episode. Thanks for sharing all the insights.
All right. Thank you.